I would like to do a quick explanation of biological magnification. Biological magnification has to do with toxic or poisonous fat-soluble chemicals. And these tend to become concentrated as you move up the food chain or as you move to higher trophic levels. An example would be DDT. DDT is a pesticide. A pesticide is something that is used to kill insects. And DDT is considered a persistent pesticide because it doesn't break down rapidly. DDT was once used widely before it was understood how toxic it was and what a problem it was when it got in the food chain. And in fact, when it was originally used, it was considered a miracle chemical because when it was used in Africa, mosquito populations went down, and with that, malaria went down significantly. But anyway, when DDT gets into seawater or fresh water, it's rapidly absorbed by suspended particles, and it's also absorbed by single-celled organisms. Phytoplankton refers to single-celled organisms that are photosynthetic that you find in the water. And any organism's cells are made of fat or lipids. And so DDT dissolves its way into phytoplankton, and it also can dissolve its way into the cell membranes of single-celled zooplankton. So here you see an aquatic food chain, and so we have phytoplankton that includes things like diatoms. And then we have zooplankton, which consists of single-celled animals and then small animals like copepods. And what eats zooplankton? Well, small fish called minnows and even bigger fish eat the minnows, needlefish, for example. And then your apex predators are your fish-eating birds. And I have some numbers here. This is from an environmental textbook. The numbers aren't important to know, but just look at the differences. If you have DDT in runoff, it's 0.000003 parts per million. By the time you get to zooplankton, it's 0.04 parts per million. By the time you get to the little tiny fish called minnows, it's 0.5 parts per million. In needlefish, it's 2.0 parts per million. And by the time you get to fish-eating birds, you have huge concentrations of this, 25 parts per million. Because think about it. Think about how many tiny pieces of zooplankton a minnow would eat in its lifetime. And since it's fat soluble, this stuff just stays in the fats of the body of the animal. So the minnows concentrate that, and how many minnows will a needlefish eat in its lifetime? And so as you move up the food chain, the chemical becomes more and more concentrated. And so again, here is another picture. It's the same pyramid of biomass I showed in the previous slide. And the picture at the top happens to be a picture from National Geographic of what zooplankton looks like. And in the middle of that picture, you can see a copepod. And so anyway, that copepod is an herbivorous zooplankton that's feeding on phytoplankton. And how many phytoplankton will that copepod eat in its lifetime? And then how many copepods will a small fish eat in its lifetime? So again, the chemical becomes more and more concentrated. And the picture on the right happens to be a picture of an osprey. An osprey is a fish-eating bird. And any large fish-eating bird that is eating fish where DDT were in the system is going to have problems. Because what happens is DDT in high concentration in a bird interferes with calcium metabolism, which means the eggshells are extremely thin. So when the bird sits on the eggs, they crack. And so you have a generation of birds that have absolutely no offspring. And when birds have no offspring, the population crashes. And so things like the osprey, the bald eagle, peregrine falcons, lots of different fish-eating birds were impacted. In fact, the brown pelicans, which are fairly common off the coast, almost went extinct due to high concentrations of DDT in its tissues. So these chemicals, whether it's DDT or other toxic fat-soluble chemicals, these chemicals become more concentrated as you move up the food chain, and again, that's called biological magnification. PCBs are now illegal to manufacture, but they were chemicals that were used in machinery and electrical transformers because they don't break down at high temperatures. And you would think the Arctic would be a pristine place, but it turns out that PCBs from the environment from the US and Europe, wind current systems brought these chemicals into the Arctic, and they were biologically magnified from phytoplankton all the way through the food chain to seals and polar bears. And so seals and polar bears have very high concentrations of PCBs in their tissues. And these chemicals are called gender benders because they mimic hormones. And so they affect the reproduction of the animals because you get the production of abnormal male genitalia, you get abnormal males and females. And the problems with mammals and humans that live in the Arctic are also impacted by these chemicals because they're eating the same thing polar bears are eating. They're eating seals, or they may be eating fish. But anyway, it's a real problem for mammals because, again, these are fat soluble. These are chemicals that end up in the fats of the animal. And when a female breastfeeds its young, the milk has a high proportion of fat, and so it's giving its young a high concentration of these fat soluble chemicals.